Yeah, we're back to the book of Ezra tonight. You can't tell from your handout, you'll be looking at Ezra Chapters 7 and 8. I think a couple weeks ago, Daryl finished up Esther. Is that right? Finished covering that book. And if you can remember, well, last week, Danny did Job, and he kind of filled in for me in a pinch. And I'm not going to pick up where Danny left off. I know there was a lot of discussion, and that's good. And some people have asked me Sunday, they said, "Go pick up where Danny left off Wednesday." I said, "No, I am not." I'm going to pick up where I left off, and that's in the book of Ezra. And if you remember, we kind of took a break in the middle of the book of Ezra to study the book of Esther. And there's a reason why. We're trying to go through these things as chronologically sound as we can. And of course, the first part of the book of Ezra dealt with the first return of the Jews led by Zerubbabel, and that was to rebuild the temple. And then really between that and Ezra chapter 7 here, you have about a 70-year period. And that's where King Xerxes, the story of King Xerxes or Ahasuerus found in the book of Esther, that's where it kind of fits in this timeline. So that event occurred between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. And then after you read about Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple, then about 70 years later, Ezra leads another group of Jews back to Jerusalem. And their purpose is a little bit different than that of the first Jews that journeyed there. And so that's kind of where we're going to pick up tonight and start talking a little bit about that. Question number 1, though, on your handout, of course, always has to do generally with something that we're going to be studying in our lesson tonight. But the question is this: what do you think motivates people to be generous?
Having a big win in life.
Okay, big win. Talking like lottery or something? Major inheritance? Yeah, a great big raise. Okay, yeah, that could be motivating.
Are we talking about generous with their money or their opinions?
Not opinion. No, we're thinking more of monetary value here, money or gifts. Okay, love and compassion can be a motivation to be generous, right? Excessive wealth, that's how I'm going to label Steve's there. Excessive wealth. Anything else that motivates people to be generous? Are there different reasons why people are generous? Yeah, there can be different motives as to why people either give gifts or, give monetary donations or things like that. Think of any other reasons that come to mind? Need? Yeah. Some people are just, I think they just really have empathy for those who are in need, don't you? They're kind and compassionate people, and they have the ability to contribute, and because of that, they feel like they're obligated and they can do something to help people in a certain situation. Are all motives for generosity good motives? No. So what would you say are some of the bad motives?
Tax write-off.
Okay. Yeah. There are certain tangible benefits that come with monetary gifts or even donating clothing or food items or things like that. And
I should say for that reason.
Yeah, right. Not everybody does it for that reason, but there are people who undoubtedly do it for tax deduction, right? And would you say, well, I just put it under the label of being a pretty selfish motive, wouldn't you? I mean, it's not that they really care about other people or they want to help anybody. It's just that they don't want to pay a bunch of their taxes to the government, and so they do this as a tax write-off. Any other things come to mind?
Sway people's opinion about them.
Yeah, I think there's social reasons that you could give. You try to impress people, or you try to build yourself up in a certain way that people look at you through outward donations or generosity. I've often thought about the idea, how many people do you think would build buildings if their name didn't get put on it? I don't know. But I would imagine there are some who are genuine in what they do, and there are probably some who are kind of selfish in their motive or in their generosity. I bring that question up because, we've been studying about these kings that have been allowing the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem. And not only just go back to Jerusalem, but going back with some pretty great gifts. What do you think the motives of these kings were? No, we've read about Cyrus, we've read about Darius. Tonight we're going to talk about Artaxerxes the First. What do you think motivated them to allow Israel to go back and to give them all these gifts to help them rebuild the temple and restore the wall and things like that?
Well, I do think that he may have had some respect, fear, whatever of the God, but probably was to win favor more than anything else.
Yeah, I think probably Cyrus would be one of the ones that you could put under that category. I think, the fact that he was so impressed that he found his name written about him hundreds of years earlier and what the Lord was going to do for him, Jehovah was going to do for him, and what he was going to do for Jehovah. And so I think in some of these kings, there was probably some genuine motivation for what they did. I think a lot of these others, though, there wasn't much genuine motivation. So we'll talk a little bit more, kind of find the answer here as we go on through that about Artaxerxes the First. All right, so we're entering into the study of Ezra and the return that he leads back to Jerusalem in chapter 7 here. Question number 2 on your handout, how is Ezra described throughout chapter 7 here? What are some of the descriptions that are given about him? Okay, he was wise. What else? His heart was prepared to do what? What did he prepare his heart to do? You can prepare your heart to do about anything, can't you?
The law.
Yeah, prepared to do the law of the Lord. What determined beforehand he was going to keep the Lord's law. What else do you learn about him?
He knew the law of Moses pretty well.
Yeah, he was a scribe, right? And what was the job of a Jewish scribe?
Write her down.
Yeah, they copied the law, didn't they? Their job was to basically transcribe the law from scroll to scroll, and they did that in a very meticulous way. But if that was your job, and I don't know, they worked 8 hours a day, or how they worked 40 hours a week or whatever. But if you did that all your life, think you'd know anything about the law of God? You probably learned a lot, wouldn't you? And so Ezra was very knowledgeable in school, not just because he copied it. Obviously, he also studied it. And he had a determination to do it. But he's a picture of a very godly individual. And what else do we learn about him? What about his lineage? Yeah, it goes all the way back to Aaron, right? His lineage. And why is that important? High priest, right? Only descendants of Aaron could be the high priest. And so you go back and this is kind of interesting because if you remember when we studied Zerubbabel and his return, there were some people who claimed to be priests, but they could not produce their heritage. They could not produce their lineage, could not prove that they belonged in the priesthood. But then you have guys like Ezra who had very, very strong credentials. And in fact, if you go back and you trace some of those names, I'll read all those names there in those first 6 verses. But there's several different guys that come to mind that I thought of particularly. Hilkiah is one of them. Do you remember Hilkiah, what he did? Well, he was the guy who found the book of the law of the Lord. Remember under Josiah's reign? That was one of Ezra's descendants. You have Zadok. He was the high priest during David's reign. You read about David. During David's most difficult times when he was running from Saul, Zadok was there time and time again to help out David. Well, that was Ezra's descendant. You go back to Phinehas. Of course, Phinehas was one of Aaron's descendants who, you remember the Israelite man who entered in the tent with the Midianitish woman in the sight of all the congregation to defy the law of God. And Phinehas goes in there and runs them through with a spear. So you think about his heritage. I mean, this is a guy who has credentials, right? He has a very godly heritage. And I often say this, does that guarantee a person's character just because you have a godly heritage or lineage? No. But in the same breath, too, it's a pretty good beginning, isn't it? It's a pretty good place to start. And so Ezra is naturally going to be a person of great renown just because of his lineage and his background. So he was a scribe. He was also, we learn, a teacher of the law by profession too, not just copying God's law, also an able teacher of God's law, obviously well-versed in the law of God. So question number 3 here, Ezra goes to the king of Persia. This is Artaxerxes the first now that we're reading about. And he asked to lead a group of Jews back to teach God's law, to reestablish God's law. So the question is this on your handout: why was the king so favorable toward Ezra? I mean, why would you expect here's this Jewish priest and scholar, and he approaches the mighty Persian king. He says, hey, I've got a request from you. I want to lead a group of my people back to my homeland and teach Jehovah God's law to them. I mean, would you expect the Persian king to say, okay, that's a good idea?
Only if he was going to get something out of it.
Okay. So you think maybe he was selfishly motivated by what Ezra wanted to do? Why else do you think? This is why it's, to me, it's always interesting to try to study the Bible in chronological order. What had happened to the Jews throughout the book of Esther? Yeah, they tried to kill him, but they had actually gotten to a point where they were pretty prominent throughout the kingdom of Persia, weren't they? Of course, you had Esther as queen. You had Mordecai, who basically took Haman's place. I don't know what happened to them whenever obviously Ahasuerus was, we talked a little bit about a while back, but he was assassinated, and generally anybody you were associated with or that was associated with your reign was assassinated too. That's just kind of the way that they did it. But there's no real historical fact about what happened, or biblical fact about what happened to Esther or Mordecai. But we do know this: the Jews had great prominence under the reign, or enjoyed great prominence toward the end of the reign of Xerxes the First. And so you have some pretty key Jewish people, or you have Jewish people in some pretty key positions throughout the empire. And it seems like Ezra was one of those guys, doesn't it? You know, I don't think the king would have just granted anybody's request coming up to him asking something about that. I think there was something about Ezra, maybe something about the position that he occupied, or maybe his relationship to the king. I don't know. But it is kind of strange when you read about it that basically the king not only says, okay, do it, but he also gives his royal endorsement by funding it and sending back tremendous monetary gifts, and as well as other physical gifts for them to take back with them. Why do you think, here's a question though, and there's not any real biblical answer to it. I just kind of like to throw these out here sometime. But why do you think Ezra asked him?
Well, he was getting feedback from the Nehemiah. I was getting
Yeah, I think you're thinking of Nehemiah particularly. There's not really, I don't think there's really any biblical statement that indicates exactly why. But it is kind of interesting to think about this. If he was a guy who was very familiar with God's law, what would he have known about the Jews and God's desire for them? Was to go back to Jerusalem and restore it, right? And that had kind of been the, for this 70-year period here, that had kind of been the motto of the Jews. That's kind of what they leaned upon and pushed at is, Jehovah God wants us to do this, let's go do it. And so I don't know if Ezra, through the reading of the scripture, takes it upon himself to go to the king and ask about it. But it would have been an act of tremendous faith either way, wouldn't it? And kind of tells you what kind of guy that Ezra was. We do learn this. What was the reason that Ezra succeeds in all that he does? Yeah, God is behind all of this, isn't he? And, he was a guy who not only studied God's word, he also, like Kyle pointed out, he did it. I mean, he did predetermine in his heart he was going to do whatever the Lord told him to do. And a person like that, is God's hand going to be upon him? Is God going to be with him? I mean, absolutely. If you think back to Ezra, the beginning of the book, why did they return in the first place? What happens? I did a good job teaching this. You remember the statement that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus? We talked a little bit. How did he do that? Wasn't it by Cyrus reading about himself in these prophecies? God stirs Cyrus up in his heart. Cyrus says, I got to do this. Maybe it's the same way with Ezra. The hand of God's with him. Ezra's reading in the book here. God says, I'm going to send a remnant back. They're going to rebuild Jerusalem. They're going to reestablish Jerusalem. So maybe that's why. But it is pretty obvious as you read throughout this that the king is very favorable toward Ezra. So question number 4 is this. We talked about Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel went back to rebuild the temple. Why was Ezra sent to Jerusalem? The temple had already been rebuilt. No, remember at the end they finish it out there. Yeah, they took a break in the middle.
It looks like he was sent to inquire concerning Judah and Jerusalem, according to the law of God.
Yeah, if you look in verse 14 there of chapter 7, he goes on to say, like Gary pointed out there, inquire concerning Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of your God. So his mission had to deal with the law of God. And basically his job was to go back and see, is God's law being taught here? Are the people doing what the Lord told them to do, his commandments? And that was what Ezra's return was all about. It was really, there was a little bit of rebuilding that took place. I mean, there was a few gates and a few walls that were restored, but the majority of that takes place under Nehemiah, which is going to come a little bit later. But they'd set up temple worship, and now Ezra is going back to see, are they obeying the law of the Lord? Are they keeping the commandments of the Lord? And his job was to teach God's law to the people. So kind of a unique idea. But how is the only way that the next generation is going to learn the truth? It's up to us, isn't it? We got to teach the next generation. And so Ezra had to go back, make sure the next generation was being taught. Now, in the first return, a little bit of numbers here, just kind of, I don't know if you're interested in this stuff. I always like to try to put together as much of a picture as I can in my head about some of these things. But does anybody happen to remember how many Jews returned with Zerubbabel in the first return there? If you go back to the first part of Ezra, you'll read that there were about 50,000 Jews that go back with Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple. Did anybody add up the numbers as to how many go back here with Ezra? There's about 1,500 men. Now the women and children aren't listed. I imagine there were some of them too. They aren't listed in the list, but there are about 1,500 men that go back with Ezra. So you're not talking about it's a sizable group, but you're not talking about like the first return where you got 50,000 of them going back. But this mission was kind of a spiritual restoration. It was this idea of making sure God's law was being taught, people were following it, it was being established there in that particular place. So Ezra's mission a little bit different than Zerubbabel and also Nehemiah. Question number 5 here. What gifts did the king give to Ezra? Yeah, silver and gold. And basically he opened up the royal treasury, right? And he provided them silver and gold. He provided them the money that they needed to do what? Why would they need money? Well, they got the temple built. It's been built in chapter 6. Yeah, you're going to have to buy all these animals. If you're going to start observing God's law, right, you're going to have to start sacrificing animals. And so all this money is being given in order to buy these sacrifices to be offered in the temple at Jerusalem. How many sacrifices do you think were offered on a daily basis? I would say there was a lot, wouldn't you? But he also gets gold and silver from the king's counselors. Do you remember how many counselors the Persian king had? I think it might be in verse 14, if I remember right here. Yeah, there were 7 of them that also contributed gold and silver to this effort too. And obviously, if you were the king's counselor and the king endorsed this cause, he expected you to give a pretty hefty donation because he was behind it. So we read about some of these things that happened. There's also a free will offering that was taken throughout the province of Babylon. If you were a Jew who wasn't going to go back, not every Jew would have been physically able to go back and make that journey, but you could help out by contributing. And so there were monetary donations, there were gold and silver, there were a lot of other things, obviously, that I think there's food items that are mentioned. Salt, much salt as they wanted, that was also endorsed to them. But all those had to involve the idea of offering these sacrifices to God. There were also, what else did Artaxerxes give Ezra? I think there's one other thing that's mentioned there.
Was it 19 where the vessels was given to them?
Yeah, the vessels. So it seems to indicate that there were not all the vessels that were taken probably in the original captivity when the temple was ransacked by Nebuchadnezzar. There seemed to be some of them that were still there in the treasury. And so I think they were, at this time, whatever was left was released to them at this time. But it's kind of interesting. You read about all these things that have been given to them. And there is a limit, though. Question number 6, if the king puts on all these gifts to Ezra, what was the limit?
It was 100 talents of silver.
Yeah, 100 talents of silver was the max that Ezra could, take out of the royal treasury. Now, anybody got any idea how much that is? You got a good Bible reference there or something? How much a talent of silver weighed?
I've seen where it weighed 75 pounds.
That's kind of the conservative middle of the road estimate, is 75 pounds. So if you have 100 talents of silver, how much silver do you have? You've got almost 4 tons of silver that they're taking back. Now that gives you an idea of the gift. I mean, we're not talking about pocket change that's being sent back with them. We're talking about a substantial amount of silver and gold and all these things that are being given to them. So what was Ezra supposed to do with these? Well, we talked a little bit about that. Buy the sacrifices, take the things that were necessary to get the law of God operating in the city of Jerusalem. So this is the question here. This is a pretty big gift that the king is given. What motivated the king to give so generously to Ezra? Look at verse 23 there. Yeah. I mean, were these kings superstitious or what? I mean, they did not want any god on that wasn't on their side, right? They didn't want any god angry at them or mad at them. And so he says, we're going to do this, and when you go back, you make sure your God's wrath. Did he know something about Jehovah's wrath? Evidently he did, right? Probably figured out through some of this captivity and things. But he said, you make sure your God's wrath is not aimed at me. You make sure I'm good with him. And so I can probably say there was a little bit of selfish motivation in what he was doing. But if you read about Darius back in chapter 6 and verse 10, you'll read kind of the same thing. Darius says, make sure you put in a good word for me and my sons in front of your God. But they were really superstitious people, weren't they? And so that was part of their motivation. And he hoped he could help gain the favor of Jehovah God by doing these things. All right. Question. Go ahead.
Well, based on what we're talking about here, don't you think that some of these stories that will be coming to, just like, what was her name in Jericho, that she heard about that and they didn't want to go through it. I mean, I think that, I hesitate to call it superstitious. They had heard enough. Maybe they had heard about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, yeah, they weren't in the dark about Jehovah, were they? Yeah.
I don't think so.
So question number 8 here, what punishment was prescribed for those who wouldn't obey the laws of God?
Executing speed.
Yeah, he gave Ezra the authority to either put them to death or they could be exiled on a kind of an island all by themselves. You could confiscate their goods if they didn't do what the law of the Lord said. You put them in prison. And so it's a pretty high up ranking of authority that this Persian king is handing over to Ezra. Question 9, who does Ezra credit for all of his success? Who's responsible for our success? God always is, right? I mean, why are we here? Who made us? Who gives us everything? Who gives us physical health, mental abilities? I mean, it's God. And so Ezra is constantly crediting God for his success. We'll do just a crash course here through chapter 8. But Ezra finds out, they go about 3 days' journey, and Ezra finds out we don't have any priests. Here we are, we're trying to reestablish God's law, and so he sends some fellows back to get some priests. I think it ends up, was it 38 Levites come back, and 220 ministering servants come with them. And so they kind of get that established. Ezra doesn't ask for royal protection, though. Now keep in mind, you're talking about thousands of people, but not hundreds of thousands. Not 50,000 like the first. You have any treasures? You got a ton of money. And this was not a safe way to travel in that day and age. A guy in an army could have decided they wanted what you had and wiped you out and took it away. But Ezra would not ask for royal soldiers or royal escort because he trusted in God. And that was really the whole movement of this, is God's behind all this. We don't need your protection. That God's going to get us there and he's going to take care of us and watch over us. And that's exactly what God does, right? They pray and fast for 3 days, and God gets them through. Read about the donations for the house of the Lord, 25 tons of silver, nearly 8 tons of silver and gold vessels that were given. A lot of other various vessels and offerings were given by the people too. They had to give an account of that. He gave it into the hands of 12 priests, And when they got there, they had to take those articles into the temple, weigh them out, make an official record of it, and send it back to the king. And so that tells you a little bit about the character of Ezra too. He was very meticulous in making sure that nothing, slid under the table, so to speak. He wanted the king to know that they were doing exactly what he told them to do with things that he had given them. So, you read about these new arrivals. Think about this. Worshiping in their homeland for the first time. Worshiping in a temple. Worshiping at the temple altar for the very first time in their lives. And don't you know that had to be a tremendous occasion for all of them to experience this. Things they'd only read about before. To experience it firsthand for the very first time. All right, that's chapter 8, speedily. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions before we end here tonight?
I think 22, verse 22, entertain least it's interesting in the American Standard, pour out shame and request.
Yeah, here, and I don't know that I'd be that ashamed. But he, that was his whole thing is this is God. God is behind this. And if God's behind it, it's going to work. If God wants us to go there to do this, He's going to watch over us, He's going to protect us. We don't need to go to the king and ask for protection. And so I think his reasoning process was, if we don't believe that God is behind this, why would they believe it? That took a lot of faith, though, didn't it? And I think we're a lot like that sometimes, don't you? Well, I think we need that kind of faith.
Well, we need that.
Yeah.
That's sometimes wonder.
Yeah. Good point.